The Sherlock Holmes Advent Calendar. The Redeemer's Coming by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. 16. The Secret Door. During dinner, I was offered the opportunity to ask Brother Peter for forgiveness for my inappropriate joke. The vicar readily accepted my apology and assured me that normally he had a sense of humor, although when it comes to God, Jesus Christ and Virgin Mary, fun would come to an end, and apparently also when it comes to mules, as I now knew. We sat at the top of the large table left of the dining room. The vicar, the abbot, Holmes, and myself were alone there, as Lestrade would not appear until later because he was still busy emptying the latrines. As I heard, there was a lively discussion about the role and meaning of the Virgin Mary in the Christian faith. Holmes began the table discussion. It strikes me that here in this convent you seem to have all sorts of great relics, but nothing that serves a corresponding devotion to Virgin Mary. Has she left no body parts, clothes, or household items behind? I looked at Brother Peter and saw that he had to force himself to calm down again. But before he could say anything reckless, Brother Francis took the floor. Mr. Holmes, he declared, regardless of the special position of Virgin Mary in the Catholic Church, I can assure you on behalf of all Christian denominations that she has left us something, and that is the most important of all, her own and God's Son, Jesus Christ, the Redeemer of humanity. His sacrifice and omnipresence are central pillars of our faith. This answer was obviously not good enough for Holmes, and he immediately asked, "But where is Virgin Mary's hair, her headscarf, a bottle of breast milk perhaps, or her still intact hymen?" The vicar slammed his fist on the table and grumbled, "What improper conduct!" Brother Francis raised his hand to stop his deputy. "It's all right," he said calmly. "You have to understand, Mr. Holmes, that there is no need for such a thing. The Virgin Mary played her part in the incarnation of God, which is the basis of her veneration. The incarnation of the Divine Trinity in the form of the Messiah is a prerequisite for the redemption of humanity. We do not need relics of Mary for this insight." "But you need the return of the Messiah," Holmes replied, "at least if I have understood the revelation of John correctly. Admittedly, this is a little confusing. What would be more practical for this than to have a God-bearer at hand again? And then all that is missing is the Holy Spirit, whose coming is upon them." I must confess I didn't know what Holmes was aiming for at the time. All the more I tried to listen closely and stayed quiet. The abbot, however, understood very well. "For heaven's sakes," he replied, smiling mildly, "are you talking about an alleged possibility of a bloodline of Mary or even Christ? Believe me, Mr. Holmes, this is just an abstruse conspiracy theory, sheer nonsense, fed on bizarre alleged clues from Leonardo da Vinci's work. No, there are no direct descendants of Virgin Mary, however much I would welcome it. We could certainly need a little more sacred authority in our world." Now I had to get involved. "Isn't the authority of the Holy Father sufficient?" I asked. "After all, the Pope is the representative of Christ on earth, the successor of Peter." The vicar who had found his humour, interjected, "Oh, you should know that a deputy is always only the second-best solution." Holmes had little left for this banter, and wanted to stay within the topic. "But how do you intend to recognize the Redeemer's new incarnation?" he asked. "An immaculate conception and a virgin birth cannot always be documented. In addition, there are fraudsters, important people and fools, sect leaders and demagogues. The Messiah will not have an easy time to be heard and to prove his identity when he returns." "He will reveal himself in a very simple way," the abbot declared. "This requires no evidence, but the right faith and the right action." "And when," Holmes continued, "is the Redeemer's coming to be expected, if I may ask?" "As soon as possible. Brother Francis replied succinctly. "At least you're praying for it," suggested Holmes. The abbot raised his hands and replied, "Everyone must do what they can." Soon after supper, we said goodbye and retreated to our room. I had the intention to go to bed early because my body was still aching from the rigors of the last few days. Lestrade finally came back to us, but we had to send him away immediately. He stank miserably and needed a thorough cleaning in the washrooms. When he returned after half an hour, he was fragrant but tired and immediately fell to bed, where he began to snore within seconds. The hard, intensive workload of the Franciscan friars had apparently overwhelmed the inspector a little. While Holmes was still sitting at the table and reflecting about the case, I too fell asleep quite soon, but my sleep remained a little restless. A nightmare haunted me, which revolved around chopped hands, removed organs, and other holy relics that suddenly came back to life. I was startled and had to drink a glass of water to calm down. After all, I now understood quite well how Catholicism managed to keep half of Europe and the whole of Latin America under its shackles of faith. I laid back down again, and Holmes hadn't taken any notice of it. I had barely slept for an hour when I was torn from my dreams. This time they were pleasant. Holmes shook me and whispered emphatically, "Watson, Watson, are you awake?" "No," I muttered, shoving his hand aside. "I was thinking," Holmes began to report. "How beautiful," I replied, drunk from sleep, trying to pull the blanket over my head. But Holmes pulled it off and exposed my ears. "And I came to a result," he continued undeterred. "Phenomenal congratulations," I commented ironically, hoping that he would understand that I did not want to be bothered any more. But just to be sure, I added, "Good night, Holmes." Of course, he wasn't going to leave it at that. But my insight implies immediate activity. My nocturnal friend explained, "Get up, Watson, get dressed. We have to go." Since Holmes already successfully ended my sleep, I complied with the request. Slowly I got up and got dressed. "Do you want to know where we're going?" asked Holmes. I shook my head. "Nah," I replied. "I fear the worst anyway. But what about Lestrade? Doesn't he have to come along?" Holmes took a good-natured, almost paternal look at the snoring inspector, then said, "Let's let him sleep. He certainly has a hard day's work ahead of him tomorrow." When I was ready, Holmes went ahead, with an oil lamp in one hand and his crutch under the other arm. "I told you about the secret passages of the late 17th century," Holmes whispered as we walked down the aisle. "We are looking for them now. I am convinced that in this monastery there is a secret parallel world with hidden rooms, stairs, corridors, and, of course, entrances." "For God's sake, Holmes," I replied with a sigh, "I have told you many times that you should not stay awake for too long. You always come up with the most absurd thoughts." "Absurd?" repeated Holmes. "Far from it, my dear Watson. My insight is the result of logical combination. Our perpetrator knows everything, hears and sees everything. He is always in the right place at the right time. He strikes surprisingly and disappears without a trace within seconds. This means that he knows the secret premises and the hidden paths through the Abbey. He knows places from which he can listen to others unobserved, and he has a hideout where he can plan and prepare undisturbed. Of course, there would also be a second option." "And that would be?" I asked hopefully. "That our perpetrator is a ghost," Holmes replied calmly. Of course, I did not believe in poltergeists or the sort, and the Catholic concept of the Holy Spirit was always incomprehensible to me. Nevertheless, Holmes succeeded in frightening me. "Then we should pray," I commented, "that the first theory is correct. But even if your theory is correct, Holmes, where do you plan on finding that secret door?" "In the library," Holmes replied immediately. I was amazed. "Why?" I asked. "Also a logical combination?" "No," Holmes explained bluntly. Rather something like probability theory, because the secret doors are almost always in the library. Don't you read books, Watson? Soon, though, we found a secret entrance in a very peculiar way. We sneaked through the shelves. Holmes illuminated various places and touched the walls. Eventually, he stopped in front of a slightly lower shelf leaning against the wall. "It has to be here," he said. But I couldn't see anything special, so I asked, "Why? How do you know?" "These books here are in ancient Greek," he said. "No one in the monastery can read that. They are just decoration, or, from our point of view, it's a diversion." Holmes handed me the lamp and began to pull out and push each book indiscriminately, shoving them back. "The books are the key," he claimed. "One of them has to set in motion an automatism." I shook my head. "If I didn't know better," I said, "then I would assume you read too many adventure novels in which the heroes reach their destination with downright ridiculous, completely implausible methods and means. I doubt a little that you will find your secret labyrinth." Holmes paused and looked at me. "What did you say, Watson?" "That is just ridiculous," I replied. "No, no," Holmes muttered. "After that." "Labyrinth?" I asked. Holmes began to smile, quickly read the back of the book with the Greek characters, and eventually found what he had been looking for. He pulled out a book a little, but nothing happened. For a short time Holmes was disappointed, but then he pushed the book back in further than it was in the original position. At the next moment the entire shelf was pushed aside as if by ghost hands. Holmes had actually found and set in motion a secret mechanism. I wasn't too surprised when a hidden access came to light behind it, just as Holmes had expected. "Unbelievable," I stammered. "Which book did you choose last?" "Quite simple," Holmes replied triumphantly. "Hesiod's Ariadnes, a text that has been missing for centuries." Inconclusively, I stood in front of the entrance to the exposed secret passageway. But there was no way around it. We had to go inside and explore the hidden spaces. I, too, was convinced by now that we could only understand the mystery of the Redeemer's Abbey behind that passage. There was no question that this undertaking entailed considerable dangers. Holmes, too, hesitated, because no one knew what to expect. The killer could lurk behind every corner. He may have installed deadly traps, but there was also a chance that he would sleep peacefully in his room as we set out to finally reveal his secret and identity. "Off we go, Watson," Holmes finally said. "Go ahead. After all, you have the lamp." I took a deep breath and approached the entrance. In front of me was a dark corridor which had to be infinitely long. Again, I assured myself that I was carrying a pistol. And then I took the first step into the tunnel.